Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Williams, and I'm a student board member of the William F. Buckley Junior Program at Yale. I'd like to welcome you to our event this afternoon, a lecture with Dr. Stephen Hayward on Edmund Burke, the first modern conservative. Before I introduce Dr. Hayward, I want to give you a bit more information on the program. For those of you who don't know, the Buckley program is an organization dedicated to increasing intellectual diversity and free speech on campus. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and conferences. You can learn more about the program at our website, buckleyprogram.com. Secondly, for those of you here who are students interested in becoming Buckley Fellows, I encourage you to check out our application, which is available on the website. The deadline to apply is September 30th. It only takes a few minutes to complete, and being a fellow gives you great access to many of our guest speakers. Finally, I'd like to note that this is the second of a series of 5 lectures that Dr. Hayward will be giving over the course of the semester. He'll be coming back on October 25th, November 8th, and November 27th. Now to introduce our guest, Dr. Hayward. Stephen Hayward is currently a senior resident scholar at the University of California, Berkeley's Institute of Government. He is also the Thomas Smith Distinguished Fellow at the John M. Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. Before this work, Dr. Hayward worked as the F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow in Law and Economics at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Hayward has also written many books on topics ranging from the environment to President Ronald Reagan. Finally, he has been extensively published in the National Review, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, among others. We're very excited to have Dr. Hayward here with us today to share his thoughts on conservatism, so please join me in welcoming Steve Hayward.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you, Lauren and the Buckley program for having me here again. I want to say it's great to be back in Yale. Actually, it is great to be back in Yale, but the backstory is I spent the last 2 days down in Washington, D.C., sort of the last place you'd want to be right now, right? And I can't wait to get out of this town and go to someplace calm where there's no controversies going on, someplace sane, right? And so I look at I'm going to New Haven. Oh, great, right? So, that's our life we live in these days. But I suppose it's fitting in some ways that this program, this lecture series, is intended to back away from these immediate controversies that are continuing to rip divides in the country and roil our life. The whole idea is to step back a little bit and see if we can't put a foundation under some of the longer-term perspectives that underlie left and right in those divisions. And so maybe it's fortuitous that I picked Edmund Burke to talk about today, the person we talk of as the first modern conservative. And that's because the whole term or the whole framework of conservative, liberal, left and right comes from the late Enlightenment and from the French Revolution. If you know the story, it's the loyalists to the old regime or whatever. They'd sit on the right side of the chamber and the Jacobins and revolutionaries on the left side of the chamber. And that's where we got left and right, which has now gone worldwide and it's become part of our furnishings. I did say, just briefly to summarize the first lecture to put things in a little bit of context, I did say when I was here a few weeks ago that there were 2 main philosophical concerns of conservatism. The first was trying to find the unchanging ground of changing experience. In other words, what lasts? What's permanent? Are there any anchors of human culture and civilization? Or is it all just permanent change and no bottom, we might say? And then the second question related to that is the what I think the most politically charged question of our time today is, what is human nature? There's lots of changing perspectives on human nature coming from both science and from philosophical approaches. And those 2 questions don't exhaust the whole spectrum, and I'll broaden this in future visits to campus. But let us build patiently. But even from those 2 philosophical pillars, you can begin to make out the conservative stereotype as someone who is deferential to tradition or suspicious of change on principle, right? You want to change something? The answer is no. What is it, right? Light bulb? No, I like the old one, even if it's gone out, right? And I think it's often useful to start on the surface of our perceptions and then work down from there. The contrast and the stereotype of the left, or of a progressive at least, is someone who's in love with change. There's even a fancy word for it that no one much uses, a neoterist. A neoterist is someone who's in love with change for change's sake. Or the moderate liberal version is just constant reform. That's a long and honorable tradition. But sometimes in the hands of certain kinds of progressives, both today and 100 years ago, it gets reified into progress with a capital P or history with a capital H even. And sometimes you'll hear this very familiar phrase, President Obama used it a lot, about the side of history, as though history was a self-conscious thing moving in a deliberate direction. That really is a secular version of the old Christian idea of providence. Hegel almost explicitly put it that way, and he did explicitly say the state takes the place of God as the agent of progress or history. So there's some of the poles philosophically, and Burke is a really interesting figure in this story because he straddles things in some ways. In fact, there's a riddle about Burke that I think is an indicator of his ultimate usefulness, and I think you can see this from what is apparently a contradiction or inconsistency in Burke, and some of you may know this. He was quite sympathetic to the American Revolution, but implacably hostile to the French Revolution. And yet those revolutions were roughly contemporaneous, based on the same principles, especially liberty and equality, but they had similar constitutional features on the surface. We had our Bill of Rights. The French revolutionaries had the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and they look similar at first quick reading. Thomas Jefferson took note of this fact. Jefferson had been a fan of some of Burke's sympathetic remarks about the American colonists' political resistance to the British government in the early 1770s. And then when Jefferson read Burke's reflections on the revolution in France, Jefferson said, "The revolution in France does not astonish me so much as the revolution in Mr. Burke." I do think that is a useful question to discuss in various kinds of courses or seminars. Why is it the American Revolution succeeded and endured, and the French Revolution devolved quickly into authoritarian terror and ultimately succumbed to the authoritarian rule of Napoleon? Now, Burke anticipated that outcome. An important thing to remember about Burke's criticism of the French Revolution and the reflections is that his reflections on the French Revolution were published in 1790. That's before the Great Terror starts, before things start falling apart, before the madness of the guillotine. And so if nothing else, he ought to get some credit for prescience about the matter, because too often we read the reflections and think, well, he's sort of looking back in hindsight on what happened. In fact, he anticipated it and before it all happened, and we often forget that sometimes. And then I think we also ought to keep in mind that one of his preeminent critics was Thomas Paine, the great author of the influential revolutionary tract Common Sense, and he thought the American and French revolutions were on par with one another, as did a lot of other British figures like Dr. Price, I forget his first name, who disputed Burke on these questions. A lot of people were saying, Paine said, Dr. Price said, look, the French Revolution's just like the American Revolution, it's just like the British Revolution of 1688. And Burke said, no, they're not, they're quite different. And the complexity deepens when you begin to perceive that Burke really doesn't live down to, if you want to put it that way, the old conservative stereotype of someone who's just against change as a reactionary, right? Keep in mind that he was a member of the Whig Party, not the Tory Party, which really was the throne and altar party in the 18th century, right? The Whig Party was the forerunner of what became in the 19th century the Liberal Party in England, which was the moderate reform party, right? And one of Burke's most famous statements is this, and I'll quote him here: "We must all obey the great law of change. A state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation. Without such means, it might even risk the loss of that part of the Constitution which it wished the most religiously to preserve." So the point is you can't squeeze Burke into a box of being a simple reactionary opposed to change in some thoughtless way. Now, I think Burke is of enduring interest in part because of his great writing. Most of the time, some sentences are tangled, but he was a beautiful writer and a lot of subtlety to his thought that takes a while to figure out. And like I say, he doesn't fit into any of the stereotypes of typical conservatives. He really does kind of stand alone in a category all by himself. Sometimes he's said to have been a defender of aristocratic privilege, or certainly of property. That's true. He was very big on property rights, not in a narrow legal sense, though, in a larger social sense. But on the other hand, he did say, like on the subject of change, he said, quote, "I am no friend of aristocracy. in the sense at least in which that word is usually understood. Another occasion he said, the worst imaginable government is a feudal aristocracy. And there's several other statements along those lines that tend to be longer and have more qualifications and intricacies to them. And there are other curiosities of Burke that are left out of popular account. He was in some ways an early critic of British imperialism. Being critical of imperialism, that's very fashionable modern times, right? But he made some very sharp charges against British rule in India, which ultimately led him to pursue an unsuccessful impeachment case against the head of the British East India Company for corruption and for ill treatment of Indians and Indian culture, he said. And he described the British rule in India as tyrannical. He actually used the T word about British rule in India in the 1780s, 1790s. He was likewise critical of British oppression of Ireland, and he opposed, to give one example, laws that prohibited intermarriage between Catholics and Protestants. He opposed slavery and the slave trade. And most curious, perhaps, although I have to skip over today because it takes a while to get through, he was a defender of the idea of permanent organized political parties at a time when that was a bold innovation and not widely liked or necessarily popular, which is still true today. These days, it's always been true that Republicans hate Democrats and Democrats hate Republicans, but I think increasing Americans just hate both parties, right? That's just the way we are. And so the point is that defense of political parties on some really interesting grounds show that he was quite modern in his thinking. Now, I think someone who caught the riddle of Burke quite well was Winston Churchill, who in a famous essay in 1925 called Consistency in Politics said this: on the one hand, Burke is revealed as the foremost apostle of liberty, and on the other as the redoubtable champion of authority. But a charge of political inconsistency applied to this great life appears a mean and petty thing. No one can read the Burke of liberty and the Burke of authority without feeling that here was the same man pursuing the same ends, seeking the same ideals of society and government, defending them from assaults, now from one extreme, now from the other. But in that essay of Churchill's, I recommend it, by the way, it's very interesting, but he doesn't go on to explain how you reconcile these aspects of Burke. He's going to leave that to us. And so the first thing to note, I think, in understanding Burke is that he was not a formal political theorist like John Locke or Montesquieu or Kant. He didn't write treatises, with a couple of exceptions of some early works that are of only minor interest. He never produced, in other words, a comprehensive political philosophy. Instead, all the work we have of Burke is in the form of letters and speeches he gave in Parliament. And even his most famous work, The Reflections on the Revolution in France, that was actually initially the form of a long letter to a French friend of his that he turned into a best-selling book. And even though he was a prominent member of Parliament, he never held a senior cabinet position. But as we shall see as we go forward here, a lot of his ideas looked like a lot of refined ideas in modern times. In fact, I think you can make out in Burke the idea of emergent social order. That's very popular if you're familiar with the literature, say from Karl Popper and Hayek, but also other figures can be mentioned. The idea of the collective wisdom of crowds, Dan Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow is one example. And also the findings of social science or social psychology about the spectrum of moral instincts, if you're familiar, for example, with Jonathan Haidt's work. So just a little bit of biography before I start getting into making some sense of all this, just to make sure we got him in the right place and time. He was born in 1729 in Dublin, Ireland, son of a prominent attorney, and although his mother was Roman Catholic, he was raised as an Anglican. And he went to Trinity College in Dublin, after which he went on to London to read the law, as they put it in those days. But he didn't finish his legal studies. I'm not quite sure why. I think maybe he was bored by them, and instead he pursued a political career, first as as we'd say today, a staff person for other politicians. But then he was ultimately elected to Parliament in his own right in 1765, where he served for nearly 30 years and participated in prominent ways in all of the major debates, often giving some of the best speeches, which remain classics today, I think. Now, although Burke expressed sympathy with the complaints of the American colonialists in the early 1770s, that is before armed revolt begins, Burke never commented directly on the Declaration of Independence that I'm aware of. I've asked a number of Burke scholars who've read everything of his, as I haven't read everything, I've read a lot, if they ever saw a comment on the Declaration, and several have told me, nope, we've never seen it either, and we think he didn't. And in fact, he maintained a discreet silence about the American Revolution after the armed struggle got underway, which is kind of a curious thing. But if you read his attacks on the French Revolution, you find a number of passages that by implication would lead you to think that if you were to ask Burke directly about the Declaration, he wouldn't have liked it very much. And that raises the acute question for us, I think. Does Burke's conservatism fit America very well, either then or now? And I think it does. I think he does have a lot to provide for us in the way of insight about the American founding and our times today. But as I say, that takes some patience to understand. And I'll say here that I didn't used to think Burke had that much to offer America. And I've changed my mind about that. Maybe it's getting older, maybe it's reading him more carefully and more exhaustively, but now I think he does. So, as I've suggested, his outlook is subtle and intricate, but I think you can begin to grasp Burke through 5 principles that interact. There'll be a quiz at the end. So, no, there won't. And there are 5 principles, but they're hard to explain fully in isolation from one another. They really work together. So I'm going to give you the bullet points of those 5, along with a couple of corollaries that flow from it. And then we'll see how some of these apply to our current moment. So first, or bullet point number 1, Burke was suspicious of what he called theoretical or metaphysical speculations. We might say pure philosophy or pure theory, right? Social orders are not made up from scratch. He didn't think you could just write a constitution from scratch the way we did here in this country, and which, as we know, a lot of other countries have copied with varying degrees of success over the years. Second, and obviously related to that thought, functional social orders are the product of history. They evolve over time, although the term evolution, as we think of it today, was mostly unknown at the time. But that does sound a bit like the progressive view I was mentioning briefly earlier. And in fact, one of Burke's enthusiastic admirers in America was Woodrow Wilson, who said he had 2 influences among European thinkers, more than 2, but the 2 prominent ones were Burke and Hegel. Well, this is kind of a curious thing. That's a stumbling block for a lot of conservatives today. They hear that Woodrow Wilson liked Burke, and they say, well, obviously he doesn't have much use because we don't like Wilson. I'm not sure if the logic quite works, but maybe Wilson missed something. I think maybe he did, and we can talk about that some later. But so, first, suspicion of theory. Second, social orders evolve over time. Third, Burke thought, therefore, the highest quality in political life, or in a statesman, he liked that old-fashioned term, was prudence. Prudence is an archaic term. Today we say judgment, or still worse in my mind, pragmatism. I always like to joke that the problem with pragmatism is it doesn't work, but that's just me, right? That Burke meant prudence in the old-fashioned Aristotelian sense of the term, a very high sense of the term. But whether you use prudent or judgment, the point is it's esteemed as a much higher quality than vision. That's the word we use today. That famous Yale alumnus, George H.W. Bush, saying that he had trouble with the vision thing, as he called it. Modern politics, we put a premium on vision, or idealism, if you want. And Burke would say, we want to be careful about that. That's not the highest value for a practicing political leader. In other words, Burke believes in the superiority of the statesman over the philosopher, or that practical wisdom is superior to theoretical wisdom. That's the reverse of the presumption of the philosophic tradition, I think, in some ways. Now, if asked directly about the 2 revolutions, the American and the French Revolution, I think Burke would say in one sentence, the American revolutionaries had prudence and the French revolutionaries did not. That's one of the divisions that he would mark out. The 4th principle, and closely related to the previous one on prudence, in fact, directly linked to it, is that the most important thing for political leaders to understand, the cornerstone of prudence in action, is the nature of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And everything depends on circumstances. And our circumstances are, of course, the product of history. See point number 2 above, if you're keeping an outline, right? In other words, a statesman, a political leader, shouldn't steer by necessarily Locke's second treatise of government, but by the circumstances in front of you, knowing what the limits might be, what's possible, what's not possible. Burke would agree with the commonplace modern formulation that politics is the art of the possible, but he would say increasingly we lose sight of that duty when we allow ourselves to get enamored of abstractions. Now, if you've connected those 4 points so far, you might think they point to someone who's a utilitarian or a pure positivist, right? That the moral rightness of political and social orders just depends on our will and accident and force and all the other things that we record in the history of humanity. Or you might even suppose that Burke is that dread thing, a moral relativist. And that's exactly how a lot of Burke's critics over the years have explained him. And I think those conclusions are mistaken. I think you have to look close, but when you do, you find out that Burke is in fact a deep believer in the natural law tradition and agrees in principle of the ideas of natural rights as we see them in Hobbes and Locke, although he departs from them in significant ways. In other words, he did not think, as Jeremy Bentham would later put it, that natural law and natural rights are nonsense on stilts. That was Bentham's famous phrase, right? This is the fifth and key point, is Burke's relation to natural law. But it takes a while to get a sense of this because it's not direct and clear. Let's consider two of his direct but complex statements on the matter let me do that again. I'll just start that again. Let's consider two of his direct but somewhat complicated statements about individual rights that are in the Reflections. Here's the first one. Far am I from denying in theory the real rights of men. In denying their false claims of right, I do not mean to injure those which are real and are such as their pretended rights would totally destroy. Now that's pretty confusing. It takes a while to unpack. Let me give you a couple more and we'll work forward a little bit. A little later on. Government is not made in virtue of natural rights, which may and do exist in total independence of it, in other words, in theory, and exist in much greater clearness and in a much greater degree of abstract perfection. And here's the key clause. But their abstract perfection is their practical defect. Their abstract perfection is their practical defect. By having a right to everything, they want everything. That's the temper of the revolutionaries in France he's describing. There's a lot packed in there, and I'll come back to that thought a bit more. But I think one of the best ways to understand better what's at the root of Burke's finesse of this issue would be by referring for a moment to that document that I mentioned that he never commented on, the Declaration of Independence, right? Especially the crucial second paragraph. You all remember it, but let's, in case you don't, you know it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. By the way, that mouthful has been set to music by the Fifth Dimension back in the 60s. If you've never heard it, it's pretty good. But that classic statement in one paragraph distills the main principles of the liberal tradition and the Enlightenment, right? Social contract theory, individual natural rights, popular consent, and most bold of all, the right of revolution. When a government's trampling our rights, we have the right and the duty to overthrow it and set up a new one according to what principles we think will make us happiest. Pretty bold statement. Very much the sort of thing Burke wouldn't care for. And why? Because keep in mind that in that declaration of the unity of the human family, the declaration isn't just about American principles. They're universal principles. Remember how Lincoln later describes it as an abstract truth applicable to all men at all times. And as I've already suggested, Burke didn't like abstract principles applicable to all men at all times, wrenched from context, from circumstance, from historical development. In fact, Burke did once say that Locke's Second Treatise of Government, the main inspiration for the Declaration, was the worst book ever written. So, and over the years, by the way, a lot of conservatives who haven't cared for the Declaration, not a lot, but some, haven't cared for the Declaration, including a famous figure here at Yale years ago, Wilmore Kendall, who I'll talk about in a future lecture some, because his legacy is important. But he and others said, you know, the problem with the Declaration is it's too French, right? Now, here's a question. I use this with students a lot in talking about the Declaration, not about Burke, but what's the single most important term in that famous second paragraph of the Declaration? A liberal will say, equal. All men are created equal. And that's certainly the way Lincoln understood it. He thought that was the most important term in the Declaration. But maybe there's another word. If you ask Burke, he would say, no, the most important word in that paragraph is secure. That one goes by kind of quickly. Remember, it says, after you declare these rights and the equality, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Point is, for Burke, or someone of Burke's understanding of these things, your theoretical natural rights aren't worth a darn if you don't have an effective government to protect them, to secure them, protect them, and perpetuate them, and extend them, right? And what he thought was that the French revolutionary government would fail on exactly that point, that its enthusiastic frenzy for theoretical or utopian perfection would undermine the rights that it sought to vindicate. Actually, someone who put it well, better than Burke, or more briefly than Burke, is Yale's own David Bromwich in the English department here, who's written some really good essays on Burke. And he said, Burke in one sentence is, revolution is the enemy of reform. I think that's very good, almost fits on a bumper sticker. So Burke is emphasizing the difficulty. So he's not saying, I'm not saying that there are no rights, they don't exist, or shouldn't exist, or not important, or however you want to put it. But he's saying that the more important problem as a practical matter is going to be having a government that can secure them. And, there will be imperfect. That's why he was always a reformer. It's easily lost. That's what he thought. In other words, the phrase we'd use today is he thought the French revolutionaries were throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But in the 18th century, you couldn't say it that short. You have to say it much longer and more elegant language, right? And so the rhetoric of rights, and I think we can see him pointing to the condition we have today where any good thing that you can mention, healthcare, housing, in San Francisco a few years ago, it was free internet access, free Wi-Fi access, is a fundamental human right. And no one says it's not a good thing to have free internet access, but what happened in San Francisco, and I have fun with students with this, is the city government investigated the cost of it. And then they said, never mind, I guess it wasn't a fundamental human right after all, because it was going to cost too much, right? You do have to talk a bit about positive rights and positive liberties and negative liberties in Isaiah Berlin's sense of the way we have the prohibitions on government power in the Bill of Rights. That divide is sensible, and the language of human rights is not ridiculous or a priori wrong, but you can see what Burke is getting at, that our desires become our rights, become our commands, and how well is that going to work? There's a whole lot of, he returns over and over again with different stabs at this. This is one of his best similes for the matter, I think. These metaphysic rights, it means abstract or natural rights, these metaphysic rights, entering into common life, like rays of light which pierce into a dense medium, are, by the laws of nature, refracted from their straight line. And he goes on and says more about that, but I think that's a great way of thinking about it. Light beam hits the water. So in other words, these abstract rights, when they hit the real world of our social interactions, it's going to be harder to make that work in some systematic theoretical way. We're going to have to make adjustments. Later on in that paragraph, he says, the nature of man is intricate. The objects of society are of the greatest possible complexity. So I'll put it another way. He doesn't think the idea of individual rights are self-enforcing or spontaneous. And, just take a look at France. The initial revolution ends with Napoleon, and today we're on, the Fifth Republic, they call it. And it could have been more. I mean, you all know the story that's gone around for years and only slowly came into focus from 1972, when Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon go to China. They're talking to Zhou Enlai, who was by then really the #1 person in China. And Kissinger says, making small talk, well, what do you think of the French Revolution? And Zhou Enlai says, too soon to tell. This is almost 200 years later, right? Everyone thought, typical American, they thought, that shows you how far-sighted the Chinese are. Well, it turns out that, later people reflected on this, and people there said, oh, he didn't mean the French Revolution of 1789. He meant the events in France of 1968, which are just 4 years old. And most Americans aren't aware of this. Many of you may not be aware of it, but France had a pretty serious political crisis in the spring and summer of 1968 that was close to being revolutionary in character, and it was not at all clear they weren't going to throw out the Constitution and do a new one and have the Sixth Republic. So this is an example, and same kind of temperaments, right? Students in the street especially, but there's a general strike, and the unions go out, and it was, Charles de Gaulle, they prop up in his dotage because he'd saved the country from Hitler, save him from, anyway. It's quite a dramatic story that tended to not get as much attention here because our own country was having its own agony in 1968, right? So the mystery, not the mystery, I hope it's getting less mysterious, but the plot thickens when you run across statements of Burke where he acknowledges the logic of the right of revolution as Locke explained it and as embedded in the Declaration of Independence. So, for example, in 1772, this is before we start shooting in this country, he says, quote, when tyranny is extreme and abuses of government intolerable, men resort to the right of nature to shake it off. Well, that's exactly what the Declaration says. So he doesn't dispute the logic of it, he disputes the prudence of it in action. Or in the Reflections, he doesn't sugarcoat. I mean, there's this one passage I do think reads very poorly where he says, it's now been 10 years since I saw the splendor of Marie Antoinette and all the stuff. And it doesn't read terribly well, even though a lot of the cliches about Marie Antoinette are wrong. But he doesn't sugarcoat and say everything's great in France, there's no problems there, it's just great, In other words, he's not a simple-minded defender of the existing regime. He acknowledges the defects of the French social order and the need for reform. He puts it this way in the Reflections, I am no stranger to the faults and defects of the subverted government of France, and I think I am not inclined by nature or policy to make a panegyric upon anything which is a just and natural object of censure. I mean, in other words, the ruling order in France does deserve a lot of criticism. The complaints about it are legitimate. But he thought that the appeals to speculative wisdom, all the metaphysic rights, and becoming very quickly a utopian enthusiasm was going to backfire, right? So I think on reflection, the person that Burke most resembles is Thomas Aquinas, the great scholastic champion of natural law, but who also, when you read him closely, I think allows for a lot of play in the joints that's gotten lost over time. So one of my favorite lines from Aquinas runs this way. Laws, he means natural laws, laws are laid down for human acts dealing with singular and contingent matters which have infinite variations. To make a rule fit for every case is impossible. Now, Burke had his own particular term for the emergent social order. He used the word prescription. He also used the word tradition, but prescription's not exactly the same thing in his hands. And the point is that it's a more precise term, but it means that there's a deep logic at work in our social order, and that logic may have been forgotten. We may not even know it very clearly anymore, but we ought to accept it as something prescribed to us by the evolution of history, by trial and error. And a couple of ways of thinking about this is, it's before Burke, but in the 16th century with Sir Edward Coke, one of the early legal theorists in England, and then Blackstone in the 18th century. They were some of the first big thinkers, you might say, who tried to systematize this unruly body of English law. You had canon law from the church, you had common laws, especially important, going back hundreds of years. And they were trying to make sense of it in some systematic way and had trouble doing it. And they all, Cook and Blackstone and others, came up with a phrase. They'd say, well, This law exists from time out of mind. You see that phrase, time out of mind, a lot. What that really means is we really don't know how this got started. We don't know what the original reason for it was. But Burke's point is put by G.K. Chesterton, a very Burkean modern figure, when he said, before you tear down a fence, you ought to try and find out why it was built in the first place. There might have been a decent reason for it. Maybe that reason has changed. But let's see if we can't figure out what it is. And that's why Chesterton said, in a very Burkean phrase of his own, that tradition is the democracy of the dead. That's a very Burkean phrase. And he went on to say, why should someone be disenfranchised from voting just by the mere inconvenience of being dead? Which I think is the political philosophy of Chicago, right? Anyway. So, but, a skeptic would immediately say to Burke or someone of a Burkean disposition, well, why should we respect the will of past generations? There have got to be better reasons for it than just time out of mind. And, there's that great scene in Fiddler on the Roof where Tevye talks about it's the prologue to the song Tradition in the play, and he says, we do this, we do that. And he says, this shows our devotion to God. And how does this go? He says, you may ask, how did this tradition start? He says, I'll tell you, I don't know, but it's tradition. But by the time of the Enlightenment, the point is we were no longer content to accept the Word of God as the sole source of the authority of tradition. I mean, the big one we got rid of in that era was the divine right of kings, right? Today, it'd be very hard to find someone who believed in the divine right of kings, but it was still lingering around in the 18th century a bit. And Burke doesn't try and work it out in some theoretical way, as I suggested. Instead, he gives us the beginning of the argument today that we recognize as the wisdom of crowds. You can see this as the flip side of the coin to disliking theoretic politicians or metaphysicians, as he calls them. I'll just read you the quote. For man is a most unwise and a most wise being. The individual is foolish. The multitude, for the moment, is foolish when they act without deliberation. But the species is wise, and when time is given to it, as a species, it almost always acts right. The individual acting alone is too prone to self-interest, to intellectual error, to all the traditional frailties of human nature and human thinking. To use a modern term, what Burke is saying is it's precisely the diversity of human types that makes collective wisdom necessary and also effective. And it's the intoxication of utopian ideology that causes us to lose our deliberative capacity and become a mob. And so what most alarmed Burke about the French Revolution, much more than the American Revolution, was he thought this represented something new and dangerous in political life. He said, all circumstances taken together, the French Revolution is the most astonishing that has hitherto happened in the world. So he thought that if you asked him, and there are a couple of letters and conversations that are reported between him and Benjamin Franklin, where he said, the British Revolution and the American revolutions were revolutions not made, but prevented. They really should be understood as significant reforms that preserved the decent parts of the existing constitutions, not throwing them out completely and restarting them. And I think you have to give him credit for that. How many setbacks have we seen for utopian ideologies in the 2 centuries since then, right? And I think there are, and I'll draw towards a close here and take some questions and things, I think. He thought not only that the abstract idea of metaphysical rights was unsound, but he thought it was going to change you might say the social atmosphere of our political life and the style of political argument. So here's a passage that you could almost apply to today in some ways, I think. This is part of his letter to his French friend. I confess to you, sir, I never liked this continual talk of resistance and revolution. That sounds familiar, right? Resistance. Or the practice of making the extreme medicine of the Constitution its daily bread. It renders the habit of society dangerously valetudinary. That's an interesting phrase, right? We think about high school commencement speeches by the students, and you admire the students for their idealism and putting together some, but you also say it's usually overly idealistic and full of platitudes, right? In other words, it's valetudinary. And we all, as adults, understand, I think, appropriate for its time and place and so forth. Or the other thing he thought was, and this is something dear to Bill Buckley, one of his last books was called Gratitude, right? About we often don't have the gratitude for the things we have inherited from the traditions, both good and bad things, I think. But Burke said this: in the meantime, the leaders of the legislative clubs and coffee houses are intoxicated with admiration at their own wisdom and ability. They speak with the most sovereign contempt of the rest of the world. He said, the French says, you had all these advantages in your ancient states, but you chose to act as if you had never been molded into civil society and had everything to begin anew. You began ill because you began by despising everything that belonged to you. And those are pretty good descriptions of where an awful lot of the left is today, I think. Many parts of the left despise our civilization and our inheritance and our institutions and our culture. And I want to sort of dismiss what the chant at Stanford, when my wife was there 30 years ago, was, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's got to go. And I know you've had some of these arguments at all universities, right? Say one more, well, I could say a lot more about that. Maybe I'll save it for discussion. And let me conclude by tying up a loose end mentioned already. I mentioned already that he said that Britain's glorious revolution of 1688, the American revolutions, were prevented, not made. I am, at the end of the day, pretty convinced that Burke would have liked the Federalist Papers. He could have written some of the Federalist Papers. I think he was very much in the same moderate, sensible, liberal, the older sense of the word, outlook that James Madison and Alexander Hamilton had. In fact, there are some passages in the Federalist Papers you can lay pretty close to some passages in Burke and see similar patterns of thinking about how institutions need to work, how politics needs to work. They were prudent statesmen, is what he would say, of Madison and Hamilton. Maybe not so much Jefferson. And so knowing that, paradoxically, those revolutionaries, let's put it this way, Thomas Paine's, one of his most famous statements that Ronald Reagan was oddly fond of quoting was Paine saying, we have it within our power to make the world over again. The most unconservative thing you can imagine saying for someone like Ronald Reagan, but he did. The American founders didn't think they had it in their power to make the world over again. They were realists in the Burkean sense. And paradoxically, they did succeed in creating a new order for the ages, that Latin phrase that's still in our money. And like Ben Franklin said, let's hope we can keep it. I think we can use Edmund Burke to help keep it. So I will stop there, and we can have some questions and discussion for a while. I get a little drink here. Anyone want to go first? No one ever wants to go first. It's just that way always, so. Oh, yes, we have a microphone for the video feed, so you look like you're gearing up for one. No, maybe? I coaxed him into it. I mean, I can keep going, but after a while, I don't. What did Burke think of Yeah, let him go. Yeah.
Right. What did Edmund Burke think of slavery, and how did he think it should be resolved if he was opposed to it?
Yeah, so the question was, so what did Burke think of slavery? I mean, he didn't write and speak extensively about it. For the main reason was it was not that acute an issue at his time, because you didn't have actually slavery practiced in Britain itself. It was done over in the colonies, and they were involved in the slave trade. But every now and then, in passing, he would say, the slave trade is obviously something we shouldn't be doing. Slavery is a barbaric and inhuman practice and ought to be abolished someday. But it was only, it's still a few decades away. What he died in, 1796. We're still a couple decades before, Wilberforce comes along and starts agitating to end the British slave trade and the practice of slavery in the British colonies. So the only reason he didn't say more about it is just that it was not on the front burner, you might say, of issues at the time. That's really about all there is to say about it.
one of the passages in the Reflections that perplexed me a little bit was along the lines of, certain laws that are restrictive should be considered among our rights. I don't know if that particular line of reasoning comes to you, and I was hoping you could explain that, the rights, liberty, and authority.
Yeah. So boy, that's a great question. That is, and, if I'm thinking of, there's a lot of repetition, of course, in Reflections. If I'm thinking of the same passage, and if I'm not, it's one similar to it. It's where he says our restraints are among our rights, or the restraints of government are actually among our rights. And yeah, he doesn't explain that in great detail, or certainly not in the sort of systematic way we would expect it from a legal treatise or even someone like Locke. But there's a couple ways of thinking about that. One is that if you accept the formulation that rights come with duties, one of the things that's necessary for our rights to be enjoyed is the reciprocal recognition of each other's rights mutually, right? I got to respect your right of free speech and freedom of worship and your own property, and you respect mine. But that means that if we're not self-restrained, you and I as private individuals bargaining together, then there needs to be the state in between us to make sure that we are restrained from doing violence to the rights of each other. In other words, I think at the root of that is some fairly standard liberal doctrine. But Burke doesn't explain it that way, doesn't want to explain it that way, doesn't like to explain it that way. Instead, he's trying to get inside your head a little bit and make you think, here he is being almost theoretical. I won't, that's an insult to him, but right, he's trying to make you understand it in a bigger way than just the reciprocity of exchange, the way I've just kind of explained it with you and me right here. So, yeah, it's just a more elegant way, I think, put simply, of saying that rights carry responsibilities, and you should be glad that the government restrains us in our passions and in our unruliness, because that's going to make it possible for us all to have our rights. Someone else? Yeah. Whoop. Oh.
So let's look at what did Burke think about the powers of government? Was he a limited government person?
Yeah, interesting question. It's hard to say because, when he's writing, we haven't really got yet into sort of that question, right? Well, and that's not quite right. There probably is a way to answer that question. He had lots of intricate thoughts on detailed things like how the cabinet should be organized and whether the king should have a sort of permanent super cabinet that only he appointed and could dismiss at will and had no accountability to the House of Commons. And Burke was against that. He thought, no, that's too much power for the king and a court, right? And his view was, so think about the way he thought about the structure of things. His defense of aristocracy was not just because they're aristocrats and, we should never question aristocrats. He said the aristocrats, when they're operating right, they're a buffer between an abusive king or too much royal power and, an unruly House of Commons, right? In other words, he described something very much like the logic of our U.S. Senate, at least before today. Anyway, I don't know. He did have, I will say this, there are in some of his essays on political economy, he did say, and by the way, here he's contesting Tom Paine. Tom Paine was an early welfare state guy, right? They had quite a great dispute between the two of them for years, and they've met each other a few times. Paine, you can read some places where he's saying there ought to be what today we would call a universal basic income, which is a live idea going around these days. And so there should be a general fund, it should be universal, everybody should get it. Sounds just like Social Security. Now, I don't know if Burke was explicitly attacking that specific idea, but there's places where Burke says, no, the government can't be providing things to people because they won't be very good at it. He lays out an argument that looks very much like the germ of very familiar modern arguments. But particular powers like, regulation, other things, I don't know that he had a lot to say about it, except, here and there he did say, the government's not competent to do too much in organizing the commercial world. He was a free trader. He knew Adam Smith and knew Adam Smith's work, so that's another way that I left that out. But he was a big free trader, and So yeah, I mean, if you could transplant him to today, he'd be a pretty conventional conservative, I think. Yeah, that's all right.
The implication of that is that the founding fathers here really were cutting edge in thinking about what government can do, what it should do, what it should not do.
Well, yeah, the big difference between us and both the British Revolution and just Britain generally is our federalism, right, with these 13 states. And, that's been an ambiguity, still is, right, but especially at the beginning, where does their sovereignty end and the national governments begin, and who's responsible for what? And they didn't think that all the way through, and we've been living with that ever since and making adjustments, right? In a very Burkean way, I think you'd say, right? That's a long story, but so that makes it a little hard to compare. To the extent that the founders thought there should be what today we would call welfare state measures, thought it'd be on a state level, yeah, probably private charity. There was, they wrote about that some. So actually, Paine, who spent a lot of time in France and in Britain during those early years of our republic, he was sort of he's an early New Dealer, you might say. He's way out ahead of anybody here in this country.
Quick question here.
Sure.
So when you were talking about Burke's sort of skepticism of meta-narratives and theory and stuff, it sort of immediately thought of Oakeshott and sort of his skepticism towards rationality in politics. I'm curious what you would think, or what you think, and I know you don't obviously claim to speak for Burke, and I don't think anybody can, but your thoughts on what he would think of the sort of epistemological claims of modern social science, and what his stance would be on the limitations and perhaps the utility of social science.
Yeah, so that's a great question. My first cut would be to say he wouldn't like it worth a darn. It's just because, it's, there's just as, William F. Buckley and a lot of modern conservatives haven't liked social science because it had this presumption to it for a very long time, less so today, I think, by the way, but for a very long time, 40, 50, 60 years ago, there was the premise that social science would actually enable actual prediction in political life, at the pinnacle, right? Burke would have thought that was madness. I think he's right about that. On the other hand, social science has gotten a lot more modest. I think they recognize that they can't do that. And I think social science is a lot more interesting today than it was 50 years ago. 50 years ago, it really was behaviorism, right? These patterns of human behavior and B.F. Skinner and all these kinds of things. And in philosophy, with these raging arguments about whether free will exists, which are still around but have kind of died off, I think. And a lot of social science now is starting to come around to studying the kinds of questions Burke suggests about the nature of emergent social order. I mentioned briefly at the beginning Jonathan Haidt's social psychology research on what he calls moral instincts. And some of that's, I know John, I like him, he's a friend. I have some mild criticisms of the methodology, and he says, that's right, but it's the best we can do, Now, you did see at the time of Burke and shortly thereafter the germ of modern social science, right? You have Condorcet. Those are the early theorists of social science that's going to be the scientific way we get total command of the world and, human social orders. And, there was the perfectibility of man was openly talked of, and that lasts 100 years or more until the real world attempts to try and do this were such disasters, right? And so everyone has gotten a lot more epistemologically modest about that in the social science world. I think utopianism is one of those perennial impulses that people return to, especially, the young, right? I'm supposed to be here to insult the young. That's what my job is, right, as an old guy. So, yeah, I think he'd have been, I'll restate it this way, he'd have been a 3 parts critic, 1 part curious about some usable parts of social science. That's my guess. Anyone else? We weren't up. We've got another one here in front.
My friend made me aware of the idea in Burke of how, in our Constitution, rights are given to you by God, by virtue of who you are, but Burke would say that they're your inheritance from your ancestors that have developed these rights and traditions that then pass them on to you. And what would you say how that would be relevant to the idea of like the boundaries of a political community and how some people can feel that they're not actually a part of that inheritance and how that can create problems? So just on those two issues.
Yeah, there's a lot there. That's a big problem, and I'm sort of rethinking a whole lot these days. So I'll talk a bit about the Bill of Rights for a second as one way of getting at this, right? So everyone knows the story that they finished writing our Constitution and didn't have a Bill of Rights. Almost all the states in 1787 had a Bill of Rights. Usually it's the first thing in the state constitutions before you start doing, governor, state legislature, and so forth. And the Bill of Rights and state constitutions were kind of preambles. They were kind of like their version of the Declaration of Independence. Here's the reason we have government, for these things, to protect these rights. And here's the structure we're going to do it with. Well, the National Constitution, they didn't bother with that part, thought they didn't need it. And a lot of states says, wait a minute, we're not going along with this unless you write it down that we have this, free speech, freedom of religion, some of the other rights we associate with the Bill of Rights. Now, an interesting, there was a real debate about this in the Federalist Papers. Hamilton writes about this, saying a Bill of Rights would actually be dangerous. He says, why would it, do you know this? It's Federalist 78 or 84, I forget which one. It's one of the later ones. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading. It's very short. So a Bill of Rights would be dangerous. Well, why could a Bill of Rights possibly be dangerous? And his argument essentially was it will misinstruct people as to the nature and basis of their rights. Because if we forget to include something, people will, by inverse logic, say, well, I guess it's okay for the government to tax dwarves. Or, pick some ridiculous thing. And in fact, I pick a ridiculous example, except at the debate in Congress, Theodore Sedgwick from, I forget which state, congressman, when they're writing out these things, saying, where's my right to wear a hat? He actually said that. Do we need to write down that I have a right to wear a hat? And the idea was, we don't need to write down some of these rights. People understand them by the basic liberal logic of Locke and so forth. Now, I think most people today say, thank God they wrote them down. Who knows what the government would do today in the way of censorship and search and seizure, and if you're a gun enthusiast, Second Amendment and so forth. But remember, there's only 10, and the 9th one is that one saying, any rights not enumerated here, we just forgot, left them out, but there are other rights that we haven't specified. Well, what are they, right? And so, sorry, I'm rambling on a long time. The whole point is the American theory has always been explicitly that your rights exist prior to government. That's the theory of the Declaration of Independence. And what Burke is saying is that's all very nice, but in the real world, that's not serious. And that's a good argument on both sides, I think. The American theory, the Lockean theory, I rather like it. It gives you great clarity. It gives you something to grab hold of. The Burkean theory is a good guide for statesmen, or people actually trying to hold it all together and make improvements in the world. Now, the second part of your question, I'm also going to begin an answer to that because I think where you're going with that is, immigrants, things wrapped up under the banner of diversity these days and so forth. So that's. I'm going to start with a narrow legal answer to that, and then see if we can't broaden it out a bit. First one is that. There are certain civil rights that are what you might say positive rights that really depend on you having legal citizenship. But if you're from another country and you come here, no matter what your legal status is, whether you have a visa or not, if you get mugged or assaulted, your procedural civil rights to be protected by the police and to have your property restored to you and to have the criminal punished are the same as anybody else's. Now, voting, of course, no. Most civil rights are accorded to anybody who's a human being who's present in our country. Now, the deeper question, I think, gets beyond rights. And I actually think it may be what's at the bottom of your question, whether you mean it or not. But that is, and here's where Burke is limited, I think. Burke's thinking very much, well, we're the British, they're the French, they're the Germans, and, we're the Americans over here. And Reagan used to talk about this when he talked about immigration in the 80s. It's back when we actually made immigration deals, right? And he said, you can't become a Frenchman. I mean, yeah, you might be able to legally get French citizenship, but you can't in a meaningful way become a Frenchman, or a German, I think he said too. He says, but anybody can become an American. And he didn't just mean that in the legal sense that you get legal citizenship on a piece of paper. But he said that, it's the great melting pot theory, which, by the way, nowadays melting pot's a controversial idea. UCLA, you're not supposed to say America's a great melting pot. That's right. This is one of these things that's now falls in that banner I was saying of sort of rejecting our heritage, right? You can't say America's a great melting pot. And it's always been the problem, right? People talk about nativism today and nationalism. Go look at the Know-Nothing Party of the 1840s and 50s, which was very much anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, right? Anti-Irish, anti-German probably too. I'm not sure about that part. But, and so this has always been a problem. But we've always had the remedy which says you become an American by embracing the country's principles. And that kind of meant the Lockean principles of, the older liberal tradition. And my opinion is that gives the United States a great advantage over a lot of countries. Because Burke is right, sort of more traditional older countries, it's harder to assimilate into their cultures. And by the way, I don't want to ramble too long on this, and we may come back to it in a future visit, but it's a very sensitive subject these days of Muslim migrants in Europe and also here. America's a great success story for that. If you look up the data on Muslims who've come to America, there's going to be high income, high education, entrepreneurs. Their quote-unquote numbers look really good. It's much less so in Europe, right? And by the way, if you look at the opinion polls, I'm a political scientist, it's a much bigger issue in Europe than in this country. Immigration in this country, in the Pew survey, which is a pretty good one, it comes in around 7th or 8th in the ranking of issues. The latest surveys out of Europe, immigration is number 1 or 2 in almost every country in terms of the issues that are most important on people's minds. And there's lots and lots of reasons for this I've just hinted at. But the point is that this is where Burke would apply. The question of rights, the legal questions that you suggest, they're important and serious. But that should be understood, I think, secondarily to the larger question of how one becomes an American and understanding our whole theory of where those rights come from, and it's a confusing matter, and we're going to keep muddling through for a long time. That's not a great answer, but it's best I can do on the spot. So maybe I'll take one more. I think we're about an hour here, so I don't want to keep people from getting back to their televisions for this wonderful soap opera that's going on. It's got hours to go, I'm sure. Well, thank you all very much then for coming.